call. That will conclude general business. Senator, sorry, I may be incorrect, colleagues. I'll just hasten to it. Senator Anning.
Yeah, Mr. President, I withdraw general business notice of motion number 745 standing my name for today, relating to victims of racist violence in South Africa.
Senator Anning, you technically need to seek leave. Can I take that as a request to seek leave to withdraw that motion? Is leave granted? Leave is granted. Thank you, Senators. That does conclude general business. Senator Hanson-Young, you were seeking the call.
Thank you, Mr. President. I just seek leave. I missed the jump on notice of motion. I'd like to put in a notice of motion for the next day of sitting in relation to renewable energy.
Leave granted. Leave is granted. Senator Hanson-Young.
Thank you.
I inform the Senate that at 8:30 a.m. today, 3 proposals were received in accordance with Standing Order 75. The question of which proposal would be submitted to the Senate was determined by lot. As a result, I inform the Senate that the following letter has been received from Senator Rhiannon. Pursuant to Standing Order 75, I propose that the following matter of public importance be submitted to the Senate for discussion: the need to strengthen our firearms laws to reduce gun violence. Is the proposal supported? I understand that informal arrangements have been made to allocate specific times to each of the senators in today's debate, and with the concurrence of the Senate, I shall ask the clerks to set the clock accordingly. I call Senator Rhiannon.
Thank you, Mr. President. We should remember Port Arthur, the Port Arthur massacre. 35 people killed, 23 people wounded, and right now the National Firearms Agreement, a very significant development that came out of that absolute tragedy, is now under threat. There is some good news. The 3 pillars that agreement was based on are still in place. Those 3 pillars are that anyone seeking to own a gun must be licensed, that each weapon must be registered, and that gun ownership remains a conditional privilege rather than a right. But what we see happening side by side with that is an incredible pressure that's being put on state and territory governments to weaken the gun laws. And this is coming from the firearms lobby. Some of the changes are really insidious. Now, in most states now allow children to use firearms, to actually fire guns. And I acknowledge the interjection. I mean, this is really shocking. Just seeing here, we've seen the Nationals really out there wanting to promote their commitment to the gun lobby, largely because their vote's been eroded by the firearm parties. And here they are doing something really disgraceful, encouraging children to use arms on a regular basis. It's also possible in this country for people to own more than 100 guns, in fact hundreds and hundreds of guns, which unfortunately was one of the loopholes that is in the National Firearms Agreement that needs to be tidied up. But there's a very sinister, particularly sinister aspect of this weakening of the National Firearms Agreement that came out on the eve of the Tasmanian election. Just days before that election that returned the Liberals to power, it became known that if elected, that party would soften the state's gun laws. The Liberals' proposed legislation would breach the National Firearms Agreement in a very extensive way. The period for gun licences are to be extended from 5 years to 10 years. Now, when the National Firearms Agreement was debated extensively in 1996, they settled on 5 years for a very good reason. So it could be reviewed if the person who had that licence should continue to hold it. 10 years is too long. And here you have the Liberal Party, and let's remember, it's actually thanks to former Prime Minister Howard and National Party former Deputy Prime Minister, which is something the national senators who sit in this place should remember, literally put their lives on the line to go out in country areas and advocate for this agreement. And here we see the Nationals and the Liberals falling over themselves to now weaken it. And from what I understand, their ideal is to actually remove it. The Liberal plan in Tasmania is also to permit farmers to have silencers on their semi-automatic rifles and shotguns. and to bring in a new category for prohibited firearms of Category E, something that's very worrying. I've heard some people speculate that the firearm that Martin Bryant used for that absolute horrendous massacre, some of the saddest stories that you could ever read, that they could again be available in Tasmania under this crazy plan that they've come forward. And then what the tactics are coming here, this isn't just something isolated to Tasmania. This is a tactic that the firearm lobby has in place, that if they get through the changes in Tasmania, that becomes like a springboard for other states. And what we know is that there was a secret firearms consultation group, no representation for the gun control lobby, but the government, the Liberal government, working very closely with those that advocate for firearms, often who make profits out of firearms. And this reach of the gun lobby has come right into this parliament, with the Home Affairs Minister, Peter Dutton, considering establishing a committee to allow gun importers to review proposed changes to firearm regulations for appropriateness and intent. Now, there's no place, as I said, for gun control advocates in what they're bringing forward here. And what we also know is that the firearms lobby are very generous donators to the Conservative parties. About $500,000 has gone in, and that's something that my colleague Andrew Bartlett will expand on. And this Friday in Sydney, there is a rally outside Martin Place on March the 23rd, under the slogan "Never Again," where students, teachers, families and survivors will stand in support of the students across America who are now joining with those marching for their lives, Senator, and demanding an end to gun violence.
Time has
Thank
expired.
you.
Senator McKenzie.
Thank you very much, Mr Acting Deputy President. And look, I am a proud licensed firearm owner and also a senator. And I agree, Senator Rhiannon, that the tragedy of Port Arthur was exactly that and should never be allowed to happen in this country again. But to assume that it is because licensed firearm owners are running around 20 years after the NFA has been in place, looking for schools, looking for opportunities to wreak crime and havoc on Australians is an absolute joke. And the fact that you stand up in this place and try and pretend that Australia is America and pretend that the NRA exists, the reality is over 1 million Australians are law-abiding firearm owners and proudly protect their homes and property, hunt for food, be sporting shooters. We've got the Commonwealth Games coming up. We are some of the best shooters in the world, and we're very proud as a nation when we see that. Well, Senator Rhiannon, you only grow Olympian athletes, including sporting shooters, if you allow them to develop the skill over time. You don't get to 25, pick up a shotgun and become a gold medalist. You have to have a junior firearm licence. Incredibly appropriate thing to do. There is right now in Victoria, it's duck season. It is a lovely cultural experience for many, many families. They go away for the weekend, they set up their tents, they go camping with friends and family, they get up early in the morning and they go shooting their ducks. And many of those, once they've had their bag full, and I thank the state Labor government in Victoria for the work that they've done to ensure that duck season continues at the strong tradition it is for so many in my home state. But you can't do that. You can't go out and camp as a family if your kids aren't allowed to come, if you can't train them in how to be safe and appropriate with firearms. Our firearm laws are amongst the strongest in the world. And I can tell you, because I hold one, obtaining a firearm licence is a very long and expensive process involving character checks, criminal history checks. You have to do safety training, restrictions on how the firearm can be used. You've got to have a recognised need to purchase the firearm. Then you have to open up the door to the police to let them come into your home and make sure you're storing your firearm and your ammunition appropriately. There's waiting periods, not just to get your licence, but if you want to purchase a firearm. Indeed, law-abiding gun owners would never risk their licence by owning an illegal gun. The tragedy of gun violence on the streets of Melbourne and Sydney and throughout Australia is not as a result of law-abiding firearm owners, and I absolutely guarantee that any changes that the state government in Tasmania is planning to make around how they register and regulate firearms in their state, as is their constitutional right, will not result in greater gun violence. I tell you what does. What results in greater gun violence is illicit and illegal firearms in the hands of criminals. In the hands of criminals. And that's why, Senator Rhiannon, instead of getting up here and moving your meaningless MPI to make Batman voters, feel a little better that, you're standing up for them after the havoc that your particular faction wreaked in that, I don't think it worked out too well for the Greens. I would suggest that if you're really concerned about gun violence, instead of attacking the million law-abiding firearm owners in this country, you'd actually support the government legislation around cracking down on illicit firearms, on the trafficking of firearms. That's something tangible, Senator Rhiannon, that you can actually do. Indeed, Labor Party senators, if you care about reducing gun violence, don't start attacking mums and dads taking their kids out to go hunting on the weekend. Don't start attacking our Olympians and our Commonwealth Games athletes. Start supporting the government's legislation around illicit gun trafficking, because that's where the problem is, getting illegal guns in the hands of criminals. Because I can tell you what, it's not the gun that actually kills people, it's the person behind it. And I know that there's some opposite who may not actually think that is a fact, but the Australian Institute of Criminology, in its Homicide in Australia monitoring program annual report, indicated that 1.3 per 100,000 Australians remains the lowest ever since records began in 1989-90. Knives and sharp objects remain the most common weapon used in homicides. So contrary to the rhetoric, contrary to the claims of the Greens trying to make this NRA-style conversation here, we have strong firearm laws. They are appropriate. They are stringent. We don't want to see gun crime. We do not want to see people being hurt with guns, and that is why we have to support legislative measures that will actually crack down on gun trafficking. So get on board measures that will actually make a tangible difference to this issue, rather than continuing with your critique of law-abiding firearm owners who are absolutely champions. I'm looking forward to handing out the shooting medal at the Com Games in a couple of weeks.
Senator Polley.
Yes, what a pathetic attempt to try and justify what Minister Keenan tried to do last year, why Peter Dutton needs to be pulled into line by the Prime Minister. For those in the chamber and those up in the gallery, as a Tasmanian who remembers very vividly what happened at Port Arthur in 1996, you only had to walk the streets of every town and city in Tasmania to see it written on the face of those Tasmanians, the tragedy, the hurt, the horrific scars that had been left on our communities, to know that any change, any softening, any change to the gun laws in this country will not be tolerated by the Australian people. Now, Mr Howard wasn't a great fan of his, but I will say this about John Howard at that time. He, with the Tasmanian leaders at that time in the state, helped bring about the world's best gun laws of any country internationally. We are admired, and we talk about what's been happening in America. You have students, you have parents marching to change things. Well, I'm speaking as someone who was a licensed gun owner. I was brought up in the country, so I knew how to shoot and how to respect a gun from a reasonably young age. But I turned my guns in. My husband relinquished his firearms as well, because we believed that that was the right thing to do. Now, what we've seen from these Liberals, both at a federal level and at a state level, in my home state of Tasmania, what did we find out about the proposed changes to the gun laws by the Liberal state government? We've heard nothing during the recent state election, but what there was a leak to the media about the secret meetings, the sneaky, underhanded way that the Premier of that state had engaged with the gun lobby to make these changes. I have been inundated from people in Tasmania who voted for the Hodgman government because they didn't know their proposal about changing the gun laws. That was sneaky, it was underhanded, and it proves that Liberals cannot be trusted when it comes to gun laws in this country. Now, we know that there are people who use guns for sport. We know that. But they have to respect the gun laws that we currently have in this country. We, as a Tasmanian, there's no way I'm going to sit in this chamber and listen to the nonsense that the Minister for Sport has put before this chamber to try and justify the changes that Dutton and Keenan had proposed. It is about time that the Prime Minister grew a backbone and put an end to this debate. We've seen how weak he is when he defended Minister Cash with her outlandish attack on women in the Leader of the Opposition's office during the estimates process. So he needs some credibility, and this is a good place to start. But it's not just people like myself that have concerns. But I want to also remind people that a Port Arthur survivor, Peter Croswell, has said about the proposed changes in Tasmania, and I quote, that our gun laws were the only good thing to come out of Port Arthur tragedy and disaster. The Alana and Madeline Foundation, which was set up by Walter Mikak, whose wife and 2 daughters were killed in the massacre, has said, and I quote, that Mr Hodgman's proposed changes are a total betrayal of those lost. That's the father who is still grieving his former wife and his 2 beautiful young daughters. There's not a Tasmanian that would have supported any changes proposed by the Hodgman government if they had been aware of it. It was deceitful, it was dishonest, and it just proves yet again that the Liberals cannot be trusted, because those who were negotiating behind closed doors, hoping like hell that no one would find out before the election day, we found out on the Friday, before the next day was polling day. It was disgusting, and I would have expected so much more from the Premier of the day not to be open and honest with Tasmanians. I support this motion because I'm speaking from experience as a Tasmanian of the impact, and we know that domestic violence is, no matter what Senator McKenzie says,
Senator,
is still a big issue, and guns are part of that.
Expired. Senator McKim.
Thank you, Acting Deputy President. Well, I thank Senator Rhiannon from the bottom of my heart for bringing this motion on, and I rise to strongly support this motion, and in doing so to strongly support the National Firearm Agreement, which, as members and senators would know, came about due to the tragedy at Port Arthur in Tasmania in 1996, where 35 innocent people were massacred. And in doing so, I want to very strongly suggest to this Senate that the Tasmanian Liberals have been caught out in the 48 hours before the most recent state election by secretly providing a policy to the gun lobby which proposed to effectively destroy the National Firearm Agreement, and of course in Tasmania of all places. You've got Will Hodgman, the Premier of our state, who likes to portray himself as a moderate and a nice guy and a reasonable person, secretly providing a policy to the gun lobby in Tasmania, not to the broader Tasmanian people and the voters of Tasmania, but to a very narrowly targeted section of our community who want gun laws relaxed, who want to make it easier to obtain licences, who want to make it more difficult to control dangerous guns and weapons in our community, provided secretly to them a policy that would actually destroy the National Firearm Agreement. And of course we heard from Walter Micak, who even today is still mourning the death of his wife and his two beautiful daughters at Port Arthur in 1996, who said this: "We would be totally betrayed to think that within a 20-year period they are looking at going back." Well, indeed, the Tasmanian Liberals are looking at going back. They're looking at destroying the National Firearm Agreement, breaking the national consensus, and what makes it even worse is they did it in a secretive way, they did it in a duplicitous way, they did it in a cowardly way, they did it in a way that shows how grossly out of touch Will Hodgman and the Tasmanian Liberals are with community sentiment on this issue in our state of Tasmania. They were caught out, and the question for Will Hodgman now is, are you going to come forward and seek to legislate in the Tasmanian Parliament to destroy the National Firearm Agreement? And I tell you what, my message to Will Hodgman is, don't you dare try this, because you will be the subject of a revolt from the Tasmanian people bigger than you've ever experienced before.
Senator Moylan.
Thank you very much, Acting Deputy President. And I'm speaking today to Senator Rhiannon's proposition that the following matter of public importance be submitted to the Senate for discussion. Quote, "The need to strengthen our firearm laws to reduce gun violence." It occurs to me, Acting Deputy President, that we have strengthened our firearm laws and we have reduced gun violence. It's certainly a fact that the basic aspects of this that occur to me is that if the Greens have brought this motion on, they haven't supported the Criminal Code Amendment firearms trafficking bill. And the Greens are saying strengthen firearms laws to reduce gun violence, but if they were sincere in doing this, our bill is about firearms trafficking. It is a strengthening and refining of firearm laws. The Greens are asking for something which years ago has occurred and which will remain certainly at the federal level. We must fight the scourge of illegal firearms trafficking, that's for sure, but it's not an issue of the need to strengthen our firearms laws to reduce gun violence. Mr Acting Deputy President, like Senator Mackenzie, I know guns. I've lived with guns all my life. Guns were part of my trade, as were the police, as in the police force, as are hunters, as are farmers, as are many people. I've seen the best and the worst of guns, and I've seen them in places where they impact on society to an appalling degree. However, guns do have values, they have value in the right hands, they have value for the right reasons, and there is no point at all in making those who are legally entitled to carry guns, who are trained to use guns, there is no point at all in making the actions of those people or implying that they are in any sense illegal. We have a first-class record in this country, as every speaker so far has agreed to. The Howard government in '96, the National Firearms Agreement in 2007. I don't support any more relaxing of firearms laws. I would not have a gun in my house, not because I hate guns, but because I have no use for guns. I'm not a sporting shooter, nor would I now use guns or need guns in what I do for a living. We have our own example in Australia of crimes that are committed by guns. We have had massacres in this country. We have criminal use of guns. In the US, of course, we see examples on a daily basis of activities in schools related to gun crime, related to massacres at concerts, in bars and other places. But this is not in any way, shape or form the United States. We saw Senator Mackenzie give us the statistics for the use of gun crime, for the use of guns in murdering. 1.3 per 100,000 Australians, with knives and sharp implements being the main method of creating havoc and creating injury. The difference, of course, in the ability to cause death and injury with a gun is quite marked. And that's why, of course, having seen activities where this has occurred, why we have strengthened our gun laws and why we maintain them as strengthened. Other implements, of course, are available. Implements that we would use in the house, knives or houses or axe or metal bars, and of course the difference between them and guns is quite dramatic. Of course, there is a great degree of logic in strong firearms laws, and we already have them. A desire to have even more, Mr. Acting Deputy President, is very, very interesting. I keep on asking myself where the justification is outside pure virtual signalling. The Greens' proposal is to strengthen, but not to remove guns, not to strengthen firearm laws. But the question that I have is, this is a generality. Are we saying we're going to remove all firearms? Are we going to say we're still going to accept certain firearms? We've all seen the basis of the National Firearms Agreement being licensed for each person, registered for each licensed for each weapon, registered for each purpose, and that owning guns is a privilege. To remove them from the hands of those who have a legitimate reason to use them and who use them as a legitimate tool is just plain silly. And any move to remove even more guns from our society, of course, is going to cost us. And I ask, how much are we prepared to pay? We have reduced the risk of the use of gun violence, except for the trafficking of guns by criminals, to a reasonable level, to a world standard level. If there is a solid business case for doing it, and I certainly can't see it, this is merely virtual signalling. We need to know if there is a business case, we need to know what the risk is all about, and we need to know what we're getting for the money that we may have to do. Are we wasting our time debating something which is now already decided? We have strong gun laws. If you want to be taken seriously, I would encourage the Greens to produce a business case, to refine what they're talking about. There could be a case that if you irrationally tighten up laws on guns and you force those guns underground, you in fact make the situation a lot worse. And of course, we need to do this with the state and the territories. We will all remember how difficult a process that is. We already have a national firearms agreement, and that is working. What the firearms trafficking bill is trying to do is address the illegal trafficking of firearms by tough penalties, by mandatory penalties, not tighten the conditions on which legal use of guns operate. And we all agree that penalties are a deterrent. Labor has agreed in the past that penalties are a deterrent, and that's certainly part of the bill. Mandatory sentences have a role in deterring crime, and society has a right to express its judgment on the seriousness of what they consider to be a crime. Mr. Acting Deputy President, the Greens have now brought this motion into the House. They've asked for it to be discussed. It would be very good if they were prepared to support the Criminal Code Amendment Bill, Firearms Trafficking Bill. And I would finish by saying that if the Greens are serious about strengthening firearms laws in order to reduce gun violence, then they will support the Firearm Trafficking Bill. And I make the point that the Coalition can be trusted in relation to gun laws. Thank you.
Senator Singh.
Well, last Wednesday, tens of thousands of students walked out of schools across the United States. They did it in silence for 17 minutes, 1 minute for every victim of the Florida high school mass murder that had occurred exactly 1 month before. The children and families are joining the March for Our Lives movement, and they'll rally, which will take to the streets this Saturday in Washington, DC, to demand that their lives and safety become a priority, and to demand that the United States ends the epidemic of mass shootings. Another school walkout is planned for the 20th of April, the 19th anniversary of Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold's mass murder of their fellow students at Columbine High School in Colorado. And unfortunately, these students are walking out because they, and I quote, want to go to school without feeling afraid. There are countless other anniversaries of horrific mass shooting murders of school children in the United States. These students could observe those, like that of Sandy Hook Elementary School in December 2012, when 20 children in first grade and 6 teachers were shot dead. Australian children have not suffered the terror of a school shooting and are hopefully unlikely to ever do so, thanks to the then Prime Minister John Howard's 97 gun reforms. The 10 largest American gun manufacturers produce and sell more than 8 million guns a year to US citizens. This is 2/3 of the US gun market that is worth around $8 billion a year. The United States has a gun ownership rate 7 times higher than Australia and a gun death rate that is 11 times higher. By virtue of the ease with which guns are accessible and regularity with which they are used to kill US citizens, more than 1.5 million Americans have died in gun-related incidences since 1968. According to gunviolencearchive.org, 37,577 Americans were killed by a gun just last year. 732 were children and 3,234 were teenagers killed or injured with a gun. There were 346 mass shootings. Key statistics are increasing each year. This year alone, there have been 48 mass shootings in the United States, and we're only in March. 3,067 people who celebrated New Year's Eve in the United States have been shot dead by someone. 140 children have been killed or injured this year, and 562 have been teenagers. So, from those statistics, it shows very clearly that in the US, this has become a reality. Gun violence has become part of their reality, occurring all too often. There has been 1 school shooting a week in the United States since 2013. And since that horrifying massacre in Florida, there have been 4 more school shootings. Just yesterday, there was another high school shooting in the United States of Maryland, in the state of Maryland. But during our Prime Minister's recent visit to the United States, at a joint press conference with President Trump, very shortly after the Florida massacre, Prime Minister Turnbull made a calculated decision to reject the example of Australia's laws and what they could set and provide. Australia's laws weren't an appropriate model for potential US gun control, the Prime Minister said, because the US has, and I quote, a completely different context historically, legally and so forth. They are very different countries with very different sets of problems. Well, on the contrary, I believe Australia has a valuable legacy to share. We suffered an average of 1 mass shooting per year in the decade to 1996. Then we faced the Port Arthur massacre, where one Sunday afternoon in my home state of Tasmania, 35 people were killed by 1 man. In one of the most courageous Australian political acts in recent memory, the newly elected Liberal Prime Minister, John Howard, with the support of the Nationals leader Tim Fischer, launched a buyback and tightened laws around access to firearms, particularly rifles and shotguns. And following those Port Arthur gun reforms, there have been no mass shootings in this country. No mass shootings in Australia. Our legacy is strong, not only domestically, but internationally as well. Australia was one of 7 co-authors of the 2006 UN General Assembly resolution calling for an arms trade treaty to better regulate the conventional arms trade and to reduce the impact of armed violence on communities around the world. The treaty entered into force in the 24th of December 2014. Australia has a record of action, achievement and safety that we should be offering to share internationally, but instead, what are we doing? we're chipping away at it slyly by the actions of Conservative governments run by Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull and Premier Will Hodgman in Tasmania. Our Shadow Attorney-General, Mark Dreyfus, pointed out last week Home Affairs Minister Dutton, Australia's would-be chief policeman and high interrogator, insidiously wants to put gun lobbyists on an advisory committee to review government firearms policy without any balance from gun control advocates. The Shadow Attorney-General rightly pointed out that Peter Dutton, talking about putting gun lobby people on his advisory committee, or Michael Keenan talking about removing red tape in gun regulation, is all, and I'll quote, just code for weakening the gun laws, allowing more powerful guns to be imported. Australia needs to reverse this weakening of gun laws. We actually need more gun control, not a weakening indeed of John Howard's legacy. But on top of that, we've had Premier Will Hodgman's government sneakily unveiling a policy to water down our gun laws in Tasmania that was only revealed in the media the day before the Tasmanian election, after the Liberal Party released its policy privately to a consultation group. It was not published on the Liberal Party website prior to the recent election. It was hidden. They were so ashamed of it themselves that even though they were doing it, they hid it. It is horrific and frightening and will breach the National Firearms Agreement. According to Tim Fischer, who as Deputy Prime Minister and leader of the National Party was instrumental in helping John Howard make the case for Australia's strict gun control laws, this sort of NRA-type push by Dutton and Hodgman must be resisted. And indeed it must be. Last weekend, Mr Fischer said he was deeply concerned about the rise of NRA-inspired lobbying and right-wing parties who are influencing pushback against our laws. He said, and I quote, "The core structure and content of the Howard gun reforms must not be done away with," he said. "Creep and corrosion of the core of the gun law reforms is a danger." Well, indeed it is a danger. The only positive thing that survivor Peter Croswell believes came out of the Port Arthur massacre was the change to Australia's gun laws. Paramedic Peter James can't believe that a responsible person would want to weaken our gun laws, especially in Tasmania. First responder Dr Brian Walpole feels betrayed and asked, "How can you trust a government that does this?" sort of sneakily just before an election. And Walter Mikac, whose entire family was murdered at Port Arthur, feels Will Hodgman's proposed changes to the gun laws are a total betrayal of those lost. He said it's about people having the most basic human right of being able to go about their day-to-day life without the risk that they are going to get killed, Mikac said. Thanks to our gun laws, Australian citizens currently enjoy that right, unlike those poor American schoolchildren. Ours is a legacy we should be sharing and strengthening, and never, never undermining.
Order.